China, 1945. With the surrender of Japan, World War II came to an end, but the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, a struggle dating back to the 1920s that had only been suspended during the battle against the Japanese, was about to resume. Seeking both to prop up Chiang's nationalists and avoid all-out civil war, U.S. President Harry Truman sent America's most distinguished general, George Marshall, to mediate. Neither Mao's communists nor Chiang's nationalists were serious about a political compromise.
The two parties had total mistrust of each other, and there was no way possible in which they could be brought together by General Marshall or anybody else. Chiang Kai-shek was not going to give the Chinese communists any part in the government. That's why I wrote the story. He thought he could win by military means.
But as Marshall continued his fruitless efforts at mediation, the communists allowed American reporters access to Yan'an, their headquarters in the remote Northwest. Between late 1945 and early 1947, John Roderick spent 7 months in Yan'an, in almost daily contact with Mao and other communist leaders.
I saw Mao practically every day during that time. You met in the small downtown area, or you went for dinners or dances or things of that sort. He was a type of person, there was an inner strength in him, a stubbornness, a kind of a superior intelligence about him. During our conversation, he talked about many things, about the Marshall Mission, about the future of China and things like that, and so on and so on.
And Mao signaled to Roderick a desire for good relations with the United States.
When he interviewed Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong was eager to come to an understanding with the United States. There was so much anti-communist feeling in the United States.
But the left-wing Rittenberg supported the communists and was often asked to translate for Mao and other top officials.
They were very open to Americans at that point. They were open to conversations. I think the main thing was the point that they were making at the time to all and sundry was the legitimacy of their regime. They had at the time, they had areas around 180 million population in China, scattered areas, mainly in North China.
I went to school in a rickshaw from the Canadian Embassy to the Nanking University, and every morning you'd see corpses lying on the roads. In winter they froze to death, and some of them had mats over them, but people didn't want to claim them because they couldn't afford. So, and there were beggars all over the streets.
The homeless and starving filling the streets, hyperinflation, rampant corruption, all undercut Chiang Kai-shek's support in the countryside and in the cities.
And I was in Shanghai, covering Shanghai, what was happening there, reporting on the poverty and the contrast of life and so on. How we lived in the Broadway mansions, a very luxurious hotel, and below us in the sampans were the poor of China. Drinking the water from the muddy canals and living their lives out in extreme poverty.
Life and Time were the two leading American news magazines. Both had been founded and were run by Henry Luce, born in China of missionary parents, deeply conservative, and a committed supporter of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. In 1945, Luce had fired Time's star wartime China correspondent Theodore White for critical coverage of the nationalists. White had collaborated with fellow Time correspondent Annalee Jacoby on a book called Thunder Out of China, warning that the unpopular and corrupt Kuomintang was in danger of losing to the communists. In the U.S., their message fell on deaf ears.
It was impossible to convince people that the communists were going to win the war. There wasn't any feeling in this country that there was anything wrong with the Kuomintang government, that they weren't honest Christian Democrats, that they weren't beloved by their people, and would win a well-deserved triumph with no trouble at all.
Jacoby recalled an episode in which an interview she did with Chiang Kai-shek was completely rewritten by Time's virulently anti-communist foreign editor, Whittaker Chambers.
I had an interview with Chiang Kai-shek once. The next week came Time magazine with several pages of an interview full of questions I did not ask, and with answers which Chiang Kai-shek did not give. Massively anti-communist diatribe. anti-communist stories which were not true, I would never have asked those questions. And Chiang Kai-shek, in spite of his hatred of communists, would never have given those answers. Whittaker Chambers had sat in New York and made up dialogue to put in the mouth of the head of one of our allies.
But they couldn't avoid Luce's influence. A report on a battle south of Shanghai, where Burns photographed nationalist troops who decapitated the communist commander and mounted his severed head on a wall, was never published. Nor was this feature on refugees with nowhere else to go, forced to seek shelter in a mortuary. The flaws of the nationalists, and frustration at not always getting reports on the issue published, shaped the way many American correspondents came to view the communists.
There was a great deal of admiration among the correspondents for the communists. And we had had such close acquaintance with the nationalist officials, nationalist forces, and we'd seen that the extent to which they were infected with corruption. The general feeling at that point was that we were looking at the Chinese Communist forces essentially as reformers.
Anybody that was well informed in Nanking at the time realized that the communist victory was inevitable. They were going to win, no matter, I mean, there we were, the diplomats and the nationalists living like maharajas. Great parties every night. People were starving in the streets. I was driving home one night from a party with a nationalist officer in one of these great black cars, and the people on the streets were eating grass. And I said, oh, this is such a terrible situation, you know, and I can't stand it, and it must be worse for you as a Chinese. And he said, we don't consider them people. And I thought, well, you know, no wonder there's a revolution.
Stopping off all along the way from Shanghai to Canton, and we got off and we saw an enormous number of people of all kinds, and at the end of that trip I wrote a long piece saying there's just no basis for any resistance anymore. There's no basis on the part of it. The officials we met had lost total confidence in the ability of the regime to survive. The intellectuals had lost total confidence, and ordinary people had lost total confidence.
And we saw the wounded being hauled back from central China and just dumped off the train.
And it was that more than it was a loss of Mukden, as far as I was concerned. I mean, it was just clear that politically there was no basis anymore.
With what became known as the WWII campaign in central China lasted 65 days. It involved over 1 million men, the biggest land battle since World War II, and it was a decisive victory for the communists.
That morning in January of 1949, on the battlefield of the WWII, I knew it was all over for Chiang Kai-shek.
There was not a conflict among the press at all on the nature of the conflict. We knew that the nationalists were done, that they had done themselves in many ways. There was no hope for the nationalists, and it was impossible for the United States to turn the tide.
I was positive by this time that the nationalists could not prevail. There's no way. There's so much corruption. So many of the generals were going into combat and selling their arms and taking the payrolls and depositing it back into their own bank accounts in Shanghai.
Next communist target was Shanghai.
We wanted to do a big essay on the last days of Shanghai, and then we worked like crazy on it. And we got wonderful stuff. The French club people kind of ignoring the war, going on with their cocktails and their tennis, and the lawn bowls out in the middle of the race course with the Brits, and we shot all of this, the nightclubs and the whorehouse bars down on the waterfront, and the execution of the black marketeers and the suspected agents that take them out in back of the railroad station and shoot them in the head. We spent a month doing this. This was going to be our big finale. we did this, what I thought was a big, wonderful essay. They never used it. Life never used it.